Good afternoon, my 1 minute, everybody. Today we're going to talk about all the different responsibilities of agency relationship as it happens in today's real estate world. Um, it is about creating a fiduciary agreement with a buyer and having the ability to negotiate for that buyer and to represent the buyer so that they get the best of what they want. So the fiduciary client relationship is very important in working with the buyer. Um, I think the instances of customer relationship is dropping significantly. I think most agents and most buyers now are aware of the benefit of being represented. So it brings up some situations that we're going to talk a little bit about today, and basically how we put it in our listing contract and how we put it in our offer contract. So I think before we get started, I'm going to block my um, camera and run down and get some water.
Um, well, I was gonna say I could probably go over pre-agency agreement. Actually, I'll let Joan do it because I'm just like not mentally there right now in terms of being prepared to speak on it.
Steph,
Um,
can I ask you a question about that real quick?
yes.
I did show a house, yeah, whatever, Saturday, and we did sign a pre-agency agreement, but we did put an offer in, and so now they've signed the buyer agency. Do I still need to file the pre-agency agreement?
I mean, we are not collecting them as part of our compliance review process. So you're always kind of just like keeping it in your like zip forms file anyway. And if you're ever audited, then that's when you would be producing it. Um, but that's exactly how you should be using it. Like you meet
Right.
somebody, you are having them sign this pre-agency agreement, and then because once you started getting into discussions on an offer, then the natural next step then is that buyer agency agreement. So you executed it exactly how it should go. So then
Yeah,
you're
so
just
I have the paper copy that we signed at the house.
so I would
And
just
so I don't have a digital copy, so should I like just keep it somewhere in a file somewhere?
yeah, or I would just maybe like take a picture of it and scan it to yourself and like drop it into,
Okay.
whatever e-file you have, which could be,
Okay.
what that could be your command opportunity. Um, so, but yes,
Okay.
that was great. Good
Thank you.
example. Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the percent of participation that we're getting on pre-agency agreements since they are not required in command. Command is a good place to put them. But it is just a due diligence as your role as a professional realtor um, is an NAR requirement from this new lawsuit. So it is something if you want to just show somebody a property, you don't know them, you don't know what they want or anything, and they may have a couple of houses that they've seen on, uh, you know, different Yahoo and places like that, or Realtor.com, that they want to see, and you can show it to them, but you have no relationship established. It's pre-agency, you're just unlocking the door, letting them look at it, but it is a good opportunity to talk to the buyer and talk about the advantages of buyer agency if they want to continue. So this pre-agency agreement is important, but a lot of agents I know are just starting off with buyer agency. And as I said, more buyers today are familiar with being represented, want to be represented, so they are signing up for the buyer agency. But be careful. You don't want to automatically sign everybody up. There may be some people you don't want to be representing. So
Mhm.
be careful on that. Take some time to get to know them a little bit. But it just means that you cannot, it's not an authorization to draft an offer to purchase. It is basically just for showing purposes and not analyzing or going over the pluses and minuses of the property. They do have something in there that you can be compensated just for showing. I don't think many people are using that. They'd rather just get into a full buyer agency agreement with the buyer and proceed toward buying a property, not just looky. All right.
All right.
So this is just, plain language. If you are an agent hosting an open house, you do not need a pre-agency agreement. You're representing the seller in that property and you're not having any kind of agreement with the buyer. You're just letting him in the house. Use for any lead or referral you receive prior to or ideally entering into a buyer agency agreement. Think of the dating stage. That's really what the pre-agency agreement is. You do not need a form for each home. Only one pre-agency agreement needs to be executed per buyer. Once you enter into negotiations, most often triggered by a discussion of the offer, then WRI disclosure to customer must be signed or buyer agency must be signed. So the two alternatives when you are starting to talk about an offer, starting to think about price and things like that, you have to go one of two ways, either as a customer with them, basically just writing down what they want, not giving them any of your benefits of negotiation or analysis or anything. Or you can talk about the values of buyer agency and get them to sign that. And make sure that you discuss all alternatives. I think some people just make the assumption, sure, they want to be represented. This is buyer agency, here, sign. You really need to define what the responsibilities are of you and of the buyer. So make sure that that is clearly defined and explained. So you have to have some kind of customer or client relationship to write an offer. You cannot write an offer in pre-agency. Everything's clear on that? So this is a little chart. When is a written agreement with the buyer required before touring a home in Wisconsin? If the role is the listing agent, no, you don't need a written agreement before touring. So if you're running an open house, you don't need to have them sign a showing agreement. If they're a buyer's agent, yes, that's required before they tour a home. Pre-agency, not a listing agent, sub, or a buyer. If you're just in pre-agency, yes, you need the written agreement before touring. Okay, that just chops it up a little bit. And this is the classic, you memorized it in your pre-licensing education. It's on both the listing agreement and the buyer agency agreement, but the comparisons of duties to a customer. They're unique to Wisconsin. If you're working with a buyer from another state, especially Illinois, it's very contrasting, I would say. It's a little more alike because of the NAR rules, but it still is different than Wisconsin comparison of duties to customer and client. And if you're a buyer from New York or Illinois or California, has questions, why are you doing this? Make sure that this is a Wisconsin comparison of duties to the customer and client. We take it very seriously. buyer-client relationship, and we have a form that you must sign if you agree to buyer agency. But here's the chart. For a customer, provide brokerage services fairly and honestly, exercise reasonable skill and care, provide accurate information, disclose in writing material adverse facts. That doesn't go away if you're just working with a customer. Protect confidentiality. That is pretty unique to Wisconsin. Duty to safeguard trust funds. That also is kind of unique to Wisconsin. Present contracts in an objective and unbiased manner and disclose advantages and disadvantages of the proposal. But if you decide to go as a client, they sign the buyer agency agreement, these new duties are tacked on. And take these seriously because you are signing a contract in the buyer agency agreement that you are going to do these things. If you are found not doing these extra duties to a client, you can be in a little trouble. They can just say you were not working to your abilities or competent, whatever. So these are serious duties added to a client. Information and advice on real estate matters. Note that you can't do that if you're working with a customer. Provide all material facts affecting the transaction, not just adverse material facts. Fulfill obligations and lawful requests that are written within the scope of the agreement. And that's very important because if they want to get out of your paying you for your representative client duties, and they are not going to pay you even if they go to another agent and write an offer, they have to show that you did not fulfill your obligations or lawful requests that are within the scope of the agreement. And I've seen that done. The other duty, and probably the most important duty that you have with your client, is negotiation. Then the better you are at negotiation, the better agent you are. The agent will not place their interests ahead of the client's interests. If you are found to be doing that, could also be in trouble because you're putting your interest ahead of your client's interest. Okay, it's a good little chart to remember. So in the buyer agency agreement, the important part of this that I've clipped out is a firm may not represent the firm's services, or a firm may not represent that the firm's services or are free and available at no cost, unless they will receive no financial compensation from any source of those services. But you don't want to put in there, free CMAs and things like that in your promotion because they're not free. If situations in the buyer agency agreement are conflicted, the client will have to pay. A specific amount or rate of compensation must be objectively ascertainable, like specific percentage of the purchase price, flat dollar amount, hourly rate. Compensation may not be open-ended. Buyer's firm compensation shall be whatever the seller is offering to the buyer. So it has to be clear what the compensation is. The firm cannot receive compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount of the rate agreed to in this agreement. So this is pretty straightforward, but if in your buyer agency agreement, the buyer is to pay you 2.4 if certain requirements aren't met, and the listing side is offering 3%. If you have 2.4, you either have to amend your buyer agency agreement or you have to tell them that you can only receive 2.4 because they have to match. They cannot exceed what's in your buyer agency agreement. So that's a pretty important fact. Keep that in your mind. 3% might look really good when you were expecting 2.4, but you better make it so that it matches in your buyer agency. Any
Hey, this
questions?
is Uma. I have a question.
Yes.
It says, okay, so here you're saying it has to be whatever was there in the buyer agency agreement, which is 2.4%.
Well, whatever is in the buyer agency agreement.
Yeah. So,
Sometimes it could be
and what if the seller is giving only 2%?
right. So then you have to amend or change your buyer agency agreement to say 2%. If the seller isn't going to change it to 2.4 or go up, then you have to amend your buyer agency agreement to match what the seller is willing to pay.
So the buyer will not give the 0.4%?
Right. I mean, that could be part of the negotiations. Seller says, I'm only paying 2% to the co-broke, period.
Okay, seller says 2%. So what if we already have 2.4 with the buyer? Is the buyer obligated to pay the 0.4% difference?
Right, because that's less. The buyer will pay the 2.4 or to the agent in according to their buyer agency agreement, or to be friendly with your client, you can amend your buyer agency agreement to match like at 2% to what the seller's offering.
Or to say it another way, you would collect 0.4 from the buyer, Uma.
Mhm.
And then you're capturing the 2% from the seller through the offer, and then you'll capture the remainder 0.4 directly from the buyer. Or as Joan said, if you want to amend it so that the buyer doesn't have to pay that 0.4, you can do that too.
Yeah,
Does Keller Williams not have any standard? Then can we keep changing it? What if they give only 1%?
Well, no, we do have standards in our ICA, so you cannot collect less than 2%. So 2% is the guideline, actually. So like your total commission has to equal out to at least 2, and whatever sources you're getting that from may vary. So between the buyer and the seller, you are collecting at least 2%. Does that make
Okay.
sense?
So it depends. Where it says compensation may not be open-ended is not true because we can adjust it depending on whoever is giving it, either from partly from the seller and maybe from the buyer as well, depending on the percentage.
So open-ended in this regard means you cannot put in there, for example, 2 to 3%. Like that.
Okay, it has to be a specific percentage or
When you're
okay.
having the agreement signed between you and the buyer, that's where it has to be a specific amount. Which again, back to what Joan said, it can be amended, but it can just never show a range right off the bat.
Okay.
That's open-ended.
That's open-ended, yes.
And they can't accept more than what the buyer agency agreement says. So if the buyer agency agreement says 2.4 and the seller is paying 3, they can't accept that, or they can try to change it in one way or another.
Right.
But they
So
can't.
then can we change the amendment to 3% in the buyer agency if they are
Yes.
willing to give 3%?
Yes, if the buyer agrees to that.
Okay.
This has to be transparent, and that's like,
Yeah, the buyer has to agree. Okay.
yes.
Yeah. And I think we've been following all of that along anyway. I don't think it was ever made clear that we couldn't accept more. We would just take more.
Right.
But
But just that it has to be amended with the knowledge of the buyer.
exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And that's transparency. That's opening it up. Hey, wait, they're actually offering more. Okay, well then let's let everybody know they're offering more and we're going to change it.
Mhm. Okay, any other questions?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Uma.
We'll move on.
Next, yep. So these are just thrown in some best practices. If a seller or listing firm is, oh, here, we just discussed this, but more than what you have indicated in the buyer agency, you may amend the buyer agency agreement. Make this amendment amendment property specific. So if you're changing that they're going to go up to 3% if the seller is offering 3% or whatever amended change you make, it's a good idea to make it property specific. Just put the address of the property that is for this. So it's not like if they decide to buy another house, they're going to be able to get 3% too or whatever. So make this amendment if you're fooling around with the co-broke compensation in the buyer agency agreement, put the address in. The same, yeah. The same is true if the listing firm is offering less, but remember, you must get permission to collect less than 2%, as Steph said.
Okay.
Okay. Buyer agency payment by the owner's agent or the listing firm or so. The firm is hereby authorized to seek payment of commission from the owner, seller, or the owner's agent, the listing firm, as through compensation agreements, provided that all parties to the transaction give prior written consent. Buyer shall pay the firm's compensation reduced by any amounts the firm receives from the owner of the owner's agent. So again, the buyer can make up the difference between what the firm is receiving and what the agent is expecting. There is no standard market commission rate, and that has to come out like syrup from your mouth all the time. Oh, that's kind of disgusting. Commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. Commissions and types of services may be based on the firm you hire. But never say, this is what everybody pays, or this is the standard co-broke commission, or this is the most common. You don't say things like that. You could continue to repeat that commission is negotiable. And then you have to support your value at this point.
And I think it's good here to like make a distinction, kind of recalling what Uma had made a comment before on in terms of like there are brokerage standards and we still adhere to our brokerage standards, and where the negotiation comes in is if a seller, for example, is not willing to pay, you know, let's say our minimum is 2.6, right? So if the seller isn't willing to pay the 2.6, well, then the negotiation there is that they would maybe potentially choose another brokerage, another firm, right? But where the antitrust comes in is what Joan was saying, that if we were saying that there's a standard across all brokerages, all markets, right? So the negotiation comes in the fact that the consumer has choices, and if they prefer to go to a discount rate, like broker, like we have to demonstrate our value at our listing and buyer consultations. So
that's the most important line right there. We have to demonstrate our value. We have to say that they get what they pay for.
yes.
Basically. And sometimes they can get less or they can pay less, but they'll get less. And the sassy phrase to that is, you get what you pay for.
It's true though.
Okay, next one. On the offer to purchase. Now this is, I would say, Steph, if you would agree, this is probably the most common now way to ask for compensation to the co-broke.
100%. Yeah.
But to remember that buyer has to be a client. You cannot put in the offer to purchase on line 543, compensate seller payment of compensation to buyer's firm if you're working with a customer. And I think most people understand that, but it's something to repeat and repeat.
Mhm.
You run the risk if you're working with a customer of not being paid at all, because you don't have an agreement between the buyer and you and your firm, that they have to pay anything, because they're just signing a customer, they're not signing a buyer agency. And you can't ask for the seller to pay the co-broke if they're not a client. So again, you need to get some kind of assurance from the buyer, customer, that they will pay you if you're not paid.
Or well, we'd have to grab it from the listing firm, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, if it's not paid for by the listing firm or the seller, then it doesn't mean that they have to get it from the buyer, or they can't get it from the buyer.
Okay. But yeah, you know, I don't know if most of you on here are, because now we're kind of dating ourselves in a sense, because a lot of this is coming from the changes that we had to adopt last August. Um, so if you're brand new, you don't know any other way, which is kind of nice. But prior to August, this was not lines 543 to 547 were not in the offer to purchase. And so now this is where we are reflecting the fact that a seller is paying for the buyer's firm's commission on behalf of the buyer. So, but another form, another way that you can collect your commission is through a compensation agreement. But we're just not seeing those too much. So if you happen to come across one, or if you happen to be asked to sign one, you absolutely can. And if you want to run it, obviously by Joan and I first, because you haven't seen it that much, please do, just to verify that, yes, you are signing the right thing. But, if you're acting as a buyer's agent out there and a listing agent has expressed, instead of putting it in the offer, we've got a compensation agreement, that is the same promise of payment as it is putting it into the offer to purchase.
You don't need both,
You don't need both though, right? It's one or the other.
right? Yeah, I
Can you
think that
please come again? What is the one or the other? Either here or?
the compensation agreement,
Oh, that's a separate agreement you're saying.
right,
Yes.
or
Okay.
writing it in the offer. You only
Yes.
need to get one.
Okay.
Okay, any other questions from anybody? This is a review, as Steph said, of our result of the NAR lawsuit. So it is new to most of us, but for new, it's the way it's done.
Mhm.
It have to be changed. Okay, but always call us and ask us if you're confused. This is the choice, I think, that um, has bothered agents from years and years and years. When I was a manager at Coldwell Banker, I had an agent, a very good agent, who always used to check the middle box. And I asked her one time, I said, and I always have to email her and say, are you sure you want this? What have you discussed with your client? And one time I asked her, I said, why do you always check the middle box? And she said, because it's in the middle.
Oh man.
You don't check it because it's in the middle. Check it because you've read it and it's the agreement you have with your client that both the listing client and the buyer's client must agree, first of all, with the same choice. The same firm may represent me and the other party as long as that same agent is not representing us both. And that is multiple representation with designated agency. So that's the whole pie right there. If the client, either the seller or the buyer, agree to multiple representation and designated agency, then anything can be worked out. So you're getting 100% representation for the seller and 100% reputation from the buyer in the same firm. So the same firm cannot represent that. If you drop down to the next one, the same firm may represent me and the other party, but the firm must remain neutral regardless if one or more agents are involved. Multiple representation without designated agency. So if you eliminate designated agency, that means you can't assign another Keller Williams to represent one of the clients. Either the listing agent defers the seller to another Keller Williams agent, or the buyer's agent defers his buyer client to another Keller Williams agent. Remember that the agency, the buyer agency, and the listing belong to the firm and not to the individual agent. So that's why designated agency means you can use any Keller Williams agent to substitute for the listing agent or to substitute for the buyer's agent. The third check is said the same firm cannot represent both me and the other party in the same transaction. And so that's, I reject multiple representation. I reject all multiple representation. Well, for a company like Keller Williams that has millions of listings and very successful in the, the popularity of Keller Williams, we have many agents who are buyer's agents and many agents who are listing agents. We have many listings. So if you're choosing the same firm cannot represent both me and the other party in the same transaction, that means that one, and it would have to be the buyer agent, would have to cancel their buyer agency agreement with the buyer, and they have to work with them as a customer. That's the number 3 choice, and it is not to your benefit. It means they can go to Shore West and write the offer at Shore West too, and to get full representation. So the next one up, and I think they're always easier to read from the bottom up. The same firm may represent me and the other party, but the firm must remain neutral regardless if one or more agents are used. So if you're not designating to another Keller Williams agent, you can't do anything. You can't be a representative. You can't negotiate for either client. You've got to be able to designate so that there's a different agent. So this is mostly the case in a double pop, or when you're selling your own, get a buyer for your own listing. You have to designate either the seller or the buyers to another agent in Keller Williams, and that's using designated agency. So if you check without designated agency, it means you really aren't using your whole services. You can't negotiate, you have to be neutral as if they were a customer, both parties. So that's why the most effective choice, because we're with a large firm that lists a lot, in both the listing agreement and the buyer agency agreement, it's wisest to choose the top choice. So that's agreeing to multiple representation, meaning it can all be Keller Williams, buyer and seller side, and you can designate if there's a conflict to dual agency, because dual agency is representing both sides, and when you do that, you really are no agency. It's totally neutral, you can't do anything. So I would avoid dual agency and designate is the best. Any questions? It's been the source of confusion from day one when they put it in.
And I think to like continue on with your example, just to like really spell it out too, when you're designating, you like, let's say I do have a listing that I'm working for the seller, obviously. I bring in a buyer who wants to have representation, then that I'm literally calling in Joan I'm designating this buyer to her so that that buyer can have full representation as well as the seller in this case. So,
Yeah, as I say, most buyers want to be represented now. They understand it better.
mhm. But 9 times out of 10, it's just where this applies to is the likelihood of me having a buyer that I'm representing in a buyer agency capacity and, using the full scope of my services, the likelihood of me finding another Keller Williams listing for this buyer is high because of the sheer size of our company. So we just need to have the clients understand, this allows us to write on any Keller Williams property in the same way that Joan is working for the seller, I'm working for you as the buyer. So that's why it applies whether or not you bring in both sides of a transaction. This just applies across the board to all buyer clients of Keller Williams and seller clients of Keller Williams.
Yeah, remember to keep in the back of your head, the listing contract belongs to Keller Williams. The buyer agency contract belongs to Keller Williams. It does not belong to the individual agent. Because they're Keller Williams, they can put their name on it, but it ultimately the firm has the clients in buyer agency and the firm has the clients in listings. I remember I went to a seminar one time on buyer agency when it was kind of new. And the speaker said, how many of you in this room have, it's like all offices, how many of you in this room have a buyer agency contract or have a buyer agents with a buyer? And, many of us raised our hand. He said, no, none of you do. Your firm does.
Mm,
It was kind of a wake up, to most of us.
yeah.
But that's why you need multiple representation. And that's why you need to be able to designate to another agent if there's a duplication. Okay, and they have to agree. That's the highlighted one on this slide. The listing has to agree to the top check and the buyer has to agree to the top check in their buyer agency agreement. So they have to agree. You can't have one that doesn't want designated agency, say, and the other one does. You have to be able to amend those contracts and have the same choice.
Yep.
All clients must agree to the same multiple representation designation with or without. All clients must consent to multiple representation. Clients may change their multiple representation choice of designated or without designation midpoint in the transaction. You just do an amendment.
Mm-hmm. And an example of that would be, let's say again, I'm representing a seller and they have chosen multiple representation with designated agency. And let's say a buyer comes along and both parties are okay with me acting as a neutral party in the transaction, then I would amend the listing contract to say multiple representation without designated agency. And then my buyer agency agreement with the buyer would read the same thing, multiple representation without designated agency. And now I'm a neutral party between the two clients.
And that's made clear, you're a neutral party.
Yep.
Okay. The other thing is that times I get calls, questions about, they have a buyer, they have a listing and the buyer is with Shore West and, what do I choose? Remember, this idea of multiple representation with or without designated agency only refers to contracts where Keller Williams is on both sides. It doesn't come into play. It's not even meaningful if the co-broke or the listing company is with another firm.
Yep.
So multiple representation means Keller Williams, Keller Williams. And whether you designate or not is the choice.
We just said this here.
I did? Yes.
Yeah, no, the highlight is exactly what you just said, so.
Yes. It sticks in my head.
I think we can move on to the next one.
Designated agency. So if you have designated agency with Keller Williams, will negotiate on behalf of you and the other client or clients in transaction. Each agent will provide information, opinions, advice to the client for whom the agent is negotiating. Each client will be able to receive information, opinions, and advice that will assist the client, even if the information, opinions, or advice gives the client advantages in negotiations over Keller Williams' other clients. So that's why designated agency does help the buyer, seller. An agent will not reveal any of your confidential information to other parties unless required to do so by law. Remember, one of the duties that you owe to a customer is confidentiality. Also, then that happens in clients too. But customers are required to not reveal any confidential information. And as I say, that's kind of unique to Wisconsin. Next slide. Without designated agency, so you agree to multiple representation, but without designated agency, it's not authorized by you or other clients in the transaction. You may still authorize or reject a different type of multiple representation, in which Keller Williams may provide brokerage services to more than one client in a transaction. Neither Keller Williams nor any of its agents may assist any client with information, opinions, and advice which may favor the interests of one client over another client. So that's why designated agency is important. Under this neutral approach, the same agent may represent more than one client in a transaction. So if you do a double pop, you can do a double pop, but you have to remain very neutral. You can't assist either the seller or the buyer in any negotiating advantages. Now, we've sort of repeated a lot of this, but it's important. If you do not consent to a multiple representation relationship, so if you reject the third one, all representation, multiple representation, Keller Williams will not be allowed to provide brokerage services to more than one client in the transaction. So say I don't believe in multiple representation, that means that only one side is represented by Keller Williams.
I've only had one, I think it was a seller who rejected multiple representation of any kind, and it was an attorney, and it was for a commercial property. So he was adamant that a Keller Williams buyer would not buy it. So just interesting. I mean, he obviously had a better understanding, maybe, but like what could potentially happen, like if it got contentious down the line. So I thought that was interesting, but that was the only time I've ever seen anyone reject it altogether.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody reject multiple representation, but I have seen them reject designated, a lot of lawyers especially, reject designated agency.
Hmm.
So Keller Williams cannot negotiate for the buyer.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's taken a lot of explanation over the years. If you are a buyer's agent and the client, the KW buyer wants to write on your own KW listing, and the KW seller is called a double pop. That's what I referred to earlier. It's really called dual agency as opposed to a double pop.
Mhm.
Remember, however, the contracts are with Keller Williams. You get both sides of the transaction, but you become more at risk of liability and cannot provide representation for either party. You can only draft what your buyer and seller want to say. You cannot provide any advice, negotiation, or benefit to either party. Better to designate one client to another Keller Williams agent for representation and work out a compensation agreement with the other agent. The KW clients may want representation and not be a customer. So you can work out any kind of way to pay the other KW agent who is designated. If they're going to take over the whole side, through the inspections and contingencies and everything like that, I would say it should be a 50-50. But if they're just going to write the offer as a designated agent, but the actual agent does most of the work, maybe it can be a referral of a smaller amount.
Mhm.
So it's up to the two of you Keller Williams agents to arrive at some kind of a agreement on how to pay each other.
I do find it's nerve-wracking to be on both sides, even in a in a neutral situation.
Mm.
It seems like a good deal, but
Yeah, I had a situation one time. I was holding an open house on a property that I had in Brown Deer. It was a really nice house. And one of the buyers walking through said, "How late are you here at this open house?" And I said, "Oh, like 3 o'clock." And he said, "Can I meet at your office afterwards? I want to buy this." And I'm going, "Oh." So they were obviously customers at that point. I was representing the seller, but when we got back to the office after my open house to write their offer, they were pretty savvy. He was a bond trader and very young, very sharp. And he wanted representation. And I went, "Oh, there goes my double pop." But we worked it out. I designated the buyer to she wasn't a teammate of mine, but she was a good friend of mine. And she and I worked out how she would compensate me as a referral. And she wrote the offer, she negotiated for this guy. But I basically was on both sides of my listing. So it's nice.
yeah. Um,
So next one, I think I've covered this.
yes, I think so too. This is our last slide.
Ha!
Yeah.
So what we covered was pre-agency, we covered buyer agency, we covered, how to protect yourself with your compensation, your commission. We covered how you fill out the choices that you have in multiple representation. And those are three of probably the most common questions that we get over agency. The big thing is don't forget to mark on lines 1 and 2 of the offer to purchase what you are. Are you an agent of the seller? Are you an agent of the buyer? Are you an agent of the buyer and seller? That means you are representing the buyer and seller. Doesn't mean the buyer is a customer. And I think we get some confusion on that. So a lot of, especially newer agents, forget lines 1 and 2 and don't cross off the other 2 choices. So you've got 3 choices, I believe, and you need to attend to those lines 1 and 2. Any other questions on this topic or any other topic popping up?
It's hard to wrap your head around multiple representation. So don't, we always say this and right to cure
Mhm.
and the offer to purchase are like kind of the two hardest concepts in our contracts. And I think it's mostly because it just might never even come up, you know? So it's hard to like kind of get ahead of it with clients because it's kind of, again, it may or may not come up. So
Yeah, whenever you see or hear the word multiple representation, just think Keller Williams, Keller Williams,
yes.
nobody else. And then you decide we want designated agency or we don't want designated. Designated agency is preferred.
I think another thing that helped me was also just like understanding that it's like a consumer protection. And so where, the reason why people have to consent to this and where I think it's more meaningful is like when you've run into like a smaller brokerage, like a one-man show, and if they bring two parties in, that could be a huge conflict of interest. But whereas, Keller Williams, we're so large that it's going to be often the case that there's going to be agents on either side. So it's really like a moot point. So that's where I think it also helped me to explain it to buyers and sellers. So
Mhm. But remember also that Keller Williams, it's Keller Williams contract, it's Keller Williams buyer agency, and it's Keller Williams listing contract. So you're just one designated agent for those.
yeah.
All right, if there are no questions, what are you doing next week? No, are you doing one next week?
We're going to be doing the GMAR Addendum AC. So that's the expansion of our contingencies in competitive situations. So the inspection contingency threshold, the appraisal gap, and the accelerator clause.
And it is competitive out there.
Yes.
It will be important.
Yep. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Joan.
Thank you,
you.
everybody.
Bye.